The elder statesman. Churchill expected to win the election of 1945. Everything pointed to his victory, from the primitive opinion polls to the cartoons in newspapers and the adulation Churchill received during the campaign, but he did not conduct it well. From the start he accused the labor leaders, his former colleagues, of putting party before country, and he later said that socialists could not rule without a political police, a Gestapo. As it happened, such gaffes probably made no difference. The political tide was running against the Tories and towards the party which wholeheartedly favored a welfare state, the reward for wartime sacrifices. But Churchill was shocked by the scale of his defeat. When Clementine, who wanted him to retire from politics, said that it was perhaps a blessing in disguise, Churchill replied that the blessing was certainly very effectively disguised. For a time, he lapsed into depression, which sympathetic letters from friends did little to dispel. Soon, however, Churchill re-entered the political arena, taking an active part in political life from the opposition benches and broadcasting again to the nation after the victory over Japan. In defeat Churchill had always been defiant, but in victory he favored magnanimity. Within a couple of years he was calling for a partnership between a spiritually great France and a spiritually great Germany as the basis for the recreation of the European family. He was more equivocal about Britain's role in his proposed United States of Europe, and, while the embers of the World War were still warm, he announced the start of the Cold War. At Fulton, Missouri, in 1946, he pointed to the new threat posed by the Soviet Union and declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Only by keeping the alliance between the English-speaking peoples strong, he maintained, could communist tyranny be resisted. After losing another election in 1950, Churchill gained victory at the polls the following year. Publicly, he called for several years of quiet steady administration. Privately, he declared that his policy was houses, red meat and not getting scuppered. This he achieved. But after suffering a stroke and the failure of his last hope of arranging a summit with the Russians, he resigned from the premiership in April 1955. "I am ready to meet my Maker," Churchill had said on his 75th birthday. "Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." Churchill remained a member of Parliament, though an inactive one, and announced his retirement from politics in 1963. This took effect at the general election the following year. Churchill died on January 24, 1965, 70 years to the day after the death of his father. He received the greatest state funeral given to a commoner since that of the Duke of Wellington. He was buried in Blaydon Churchyard beside his parents and within sight of his birthplace, Blenheim Palace. The Family Man. In the autumn of 1908 Churchill, then a rising Liberal politician, married Clementine Hozier, granddaughter of the 10th Earl of Airlie. Their marriage was to prove a long and happy one, though there were often quarrels. Clementine once threw a dish of spinach at Winston, it missed. Clementine was high-principled and highly strung, Winston was stubborn and ambitious. His work invariably came first, though, partly as a reaction against his own upbringing, he was devoted to his children. Winston and Clementine's first child, Diana, was born in 1909. Diana was a naughty little girl and continued to cause her parents great distress as an adult. In 1932 she married John Bailey, but the marriage was unsuccessful and they divorced in 1935. In that year she married the conservative politician, Duncan Sandys, and they had 3 children. That marriage also proved a failure. Diana had several nervous breakdowns and in 1963 she committed suicide. The Churchill's second child and only son, Randolph, was born in 1911. He was exceptionally handsome and rumbustious, and his father was very ambitious for him. During the 1930s Randolph stood for Parliament several times, but he failed to get in, being regarded as a political maverick. He did serve as Conservative Member of Parliament for Preston between 1940 and 1945, and ultimately became an extremely successful journalist and began the official biography of his father during the 1960s. Randolph was married twice, first in 1939 to Pamela Digby, later Harriman, by whom he had a son, Winston, and secondly in 1948 to June Osborne, by whom he had a daughter, Arabella. Neither marriage was a success. The life of Sarah, the Churchills' third child, born in 1914, was no happier than that of her elder siblings. Amateur dramatics at Chartwell led her to take up a career on the stage, which flourished for a time. Sarah's charm and vitality were also apparent in her private life, but her first two marriages proved unsuccessful, and she was widowed soon after her third. Her first husband was a music hall artist called Vic Oliver, whom she married against her parents' wishes. Her second was Anthony Beecham, but this marriage did not last, and after their separation, he committed suicide. In 1918, Clementine Churchill gave birth to a third girl, Marigold. But in 1921, shortly after the deaths of both Clementine's brother and Winston's mother, Marigold contracted septicemia whilst on a seaside holiday with the children's governess. When she died, Winston was grief-stricken and, as his last private secretary recently disclosed in an autobiography, Clementine screamed like an animal undergoing torture. The following September the Churchills' fifth and last child, Mary, was born. Unlike her brother and older sisters, Mary was to cause her parents no major worries. Indeed, she was a constant source of support, especially to her mother. In 1947, she married Christopher Soames, who was then assistant military attaché in Paris and later had a successful parliamentary and diplomatic career. Theirs was to be a long and happy marriage. Over the years, Christopher became a valued confidant and counselor to his father-in-law. They had 5 children, the eldest of whom, Nicholas, became a prominent member of the Conservative Party. Christopher Soames died in 1987. The private man Churchill's enormous reserves of energy and his legendary ability to exist on very little sleep gave him time to pursue a wide variety of interests outside the world of politics. Churchill loved gambling and lost what was, for him, a small fortune in the great crash of the American stock market in October 1929, causing a severe setback to the family finances. But he continued to write as a means of maintaining the style of life to which he had always been accustomed. Apart from his major works, notably his multi-volume histories of the First and Second World Wars and the life of his illustrious ancestor John, 1st Duke of Marlborough, he poured forth speeches and articles for newspapers and magazines. His last big book was The History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which he had begun in 1938 and which was eventually published in the 1950s. In 1953, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Churchill took up painting as an antidote to the anguish he felt over the Dardanelles disaster. Painting became a constant solace and preoccupation, and he rarely spent a few days away from home without taking his canvas and brushes. Even during his tour of France's Maginot Line in the middle of August 1939, Churchill managed to snatch a painting holiday with friends near Dreux. In the summer of 1922, while on the lookout for a suitable country house, Churchill caught sight of a property near Westerham in Kent, and fell instantly in love with it. Despite Clementine's initial lack of enthusiasm for the dilapidated and neglected house, with its overgrown and seemingly unmanageable grounds, Chartwell was to become a much-loved family home. Clementine, however, never quite overcame her resentment of the fact that Winston had been less than frank with her over the buying of Chartwell, and from time to time her feelings surfaced. With typical enthusiasm, Churchill personally undertook many major works of construction at Chartwell, such as a dam, a swimming pool, the building, largely with his own hands, of a red brick wall to surround the vegetable garden, and the retiling of a cottage at the bottom of the garden. In 1946, Churchill bought a farm adjoining Chartwell and subsequently derived much pleasure, though little profit, from farming. Churchill was born into the world of hunting, shooting and fishing, and throughout his life they were to prove spasmodic distractions. But it was hunting and polo, first learned as a young cavalry officer in India, that he enjoyed most of all. In the summer of 1949, Churchill embarked on a new venture. He bought a racehorse. On the advice of Christopher Soames, he purchased a grey 3-year-old colt, Colonist II. It was to be the first of several thoroughbreds in his small stud. They were registered in Lord Randolph's colours, pink, with chocolate sleeves and cap. These have been adopted as the colours of Churchill College. Churchill was made a member of the Jockey Club in 1950, and greatly relished the distinction. Among Winston's closest friends were Professor Lindemann and the Three Bs, none popular with Clementine, Birkenhead, Beaverbrook, Bracken. The Churchills entertained widely, including among their guests Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein and Lawrence of Arabia. Churchill regularly holidayed with rich friends in the Mediterranean, spending several cruises in the late 1950s as the guest of Greek millionaire shipowner, Aristotle Onassis. Churchill died shortly after 8 a.m. today, 10 days after he suffered a stroke, it was announced officially. He was 90. Sir Winston's secretary released the announcement signed by the statesman's physician, Lord Moran. It read, shortly after 8 this morning, Sunday, January 24, Sir Winston Churchill died at his London home. Signed, Moran. The old warrior's last illness began with a cold that confined him to his bed at his Georgian home at No. 28 Hyde Park Gate. A circulatory weakness developed, and he suffered a cerebral thrombosis, or stroke. From then until the inevitable end only his stalwart spirit sustained him. Gradually weakening, he slipped painlessly toward death. Because of his age, his doctors decided against trying to move him from his bedroom to a hospital. Announcement of Sir Winston's death 8 weeks after his 90th birthday was made at 8:36 a.m. Death came to the greatest commoner in English history as he lay in his room on the ground floor of No. 28 Hyde Park Gate in the capital, where he rallied the forces of freedom during World War II. With him at his bedside when the end came were his faithful wife, Clementine, 79, his son, Randolph, daughters, Sarah and Mrs. Mary Soames, and grandchildren. Lord Moran, Churchill's longtime friend and physician, also was at his side. A state funeral was certain for this giant of a man who twice served Britain as Prime Minister and rallied her people to their finest hour when the armies of Adolf Hitler were sweeping across Europe to the English Channel. Funeral services are expected to be held in St. Paul's Cathedral, last resting place of Britain's military immortals. But under present plans, he will be buried in a simple parish church in accordance with his wish to be near his father and his American-born mother. Before the funeral he is expected to lie in state in London's Westminster Hall, now a part of the Houses of Parliament in which Sir Winston served for 62 years. Until police closed off the dead-end street leading to the Churchill home, Londoners by the thousands had paused for a look at the house where the old statesman was dying. It was there that the public had glimpsed him for the last time. The occasion was the eve of his 90th birthday, last November 29. Nearly 1,000 persons stood in the cold and drizzle on that day to sing "Happy Birthday to You" while Sir Winston made a brief appearance at a window. Although he had to be helped from his chair by a nurse and Lady Churchill, he seemed well and happy then and waved a greeting to the crowd. Shortly after the news of his death was announced, the British Broadcasting immediately began playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, whose opening notes formed the Morse code letter V for victory during the war. After news of Churchill's death reached the small crowd at the entrance to Hyde Park Gate, they stood around in small groups in a light drizzle chatting quietly with each other. Lord Moran had reported last night, the deterioration of Sir Winston's condition is more marked. The report was the 19th medical bulletin since the 90-year-old wartime Prime Minister suffered a stroke on Jan. 15. Medical sources said the report indicated further weakening of Churchill's circulatory system, which was first reported last Wednesday when his condition was at a very low ebb. The change for the worse apparently occurred Friday afternoon or evening. Sir Winston had been in a coma almost since he was stricken. Competent medical sources said he had been given a nutrient by tubes, intravenously or otherwise. Tomorrow, if Sir Winston were alive, would have been a day of remembrance in the red brick house in Hyde Park Gate. It is the 70th anniversary of the death of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, whose brilliant political career was cut off at 46.